to the group, and it's always a member. And it's just an opportunity to read in front of a supportive audience. So tonight's reader is Eric Moser. He lives in Terrebonne. He's been a guild member for about 6 years. He had the idea for the story he will read tonight while working on his MGB Roadster this winter, pondering the imponderables posed by British engineering. Please welcome Eric Moser.
Yes, this came to me, the germ of the idea came to me about 3 months ago with the transmission laying all over the floor and sub-zero temperatures in the garage. So here we go. I have no real title for it. Pops gave me the keys to the car on my wedding day. There was a tear in his eye for the car, I think, as he dropped the key into my reluctantly open hand. Let me explain. The car in question is a 1959 MGA, which is a British roadster typical of its era. That is, rounded curves, chrome, wood, and leather, tiny and very underpowered. On today's highways, an ancient roadster might as well have the word death trap written on it, prominently on the dash, right above the oil pressure and coolant temperature gauge. We did not, Fanny and I, as Pops intended, take the car on our honeymoon. Instead, we drove our sensible sedan. The MG sat in the garage and leaked a puddle of oil on the floor like a puppy left behind. You don't simply drive a roadster, by the way, not of that era. You experience it, getting down the road merely in detail. I had recalled the many hours and days, frankly, Pop spent sprawled under the MG or half engulfed in the engine bay as if being eaten by it. I do recall it actually running, and Pop's going off down our little lane with a happy backwards wave to Mom, herself with a sort of false cheer that once sent young men off to war. Yet Mom did seem positively effervescent each time she herself stepped into the MG. Ordinarily, she came across as a thoughtful, quiet type, but some sort of madness seemed to blind her towards the car. Many a time I recalled her washing and waxing the little deer, even as Pop's all elbows and knees and in the way tinkered. Now, mind you, an MG is a working man's roadster, no luxury, as say a Jaguar XK at the time. So what love lost on her was double the mystery to me. Growing up, I had little interest in the car. Pops never took it badly. To be clear, he was not terribly mechanically inclined towards other things. All in all, Pops and Mom were a cheerful couple, and we a happy little family. Besides the MG, we had very little. A small cottage. Mom kept a garden. She did pottery. She puttered and potted. Pops painted landscapes. They sold some stuff. In the evenings, we read and played music. Retrograde is not a term when we live in. To be fair, the plucky little car seemed to fit us. There's something happy and energetic about its lines, much more muted, as is the pocketbook of the typical owner, than the Rubenesque style Jaguar, if you get my meaning. The back fender of an MGA implies a youthful crouch. It's lean in the waist. Its front fenders are outreaching, giving a particular heads-up, bright-eyed approach to the road. There's none of the repose, paws firmly down, regally smug feel of the Jag. An MG has a bob-haired cut, girl next door look. In the stories of us, as all families have, mostly as told by Pops, the MG had a prominent role. In his telling, it came across as a touchstone of reliability, durability, practicality, non-inherent qualities of an MG. The signature story, you might call it the family's origination myth, involves Pops and Mom's very first cross-country trip with the MG. All these stories, these parables, really are similar. Pops and Mom take a trip without another thought or care on their minds, but presumably to get some. Right there, the informed listener should know something's fishy. Then, surprise, nothing of the sort happens. The return spring of the starter solenoid breaks. The propeller shaft yoke breaks. The water pump ceases. The engine rear seal begins to gush oil. The timing chain skips a tube. The head gasket blows. The intake manifold leaks. You get the idea. But lo, where do they find themselves in these dire and yet fateful moments? How about besides a river where Pops takes a thermos to gather water for the leaking radiator? So beautifully set between pillars of rock and under such a beautifully toned sky, with flights of swans daubed on, fat trout suspended in the lazy glides, all in the buzzy drowse of a fragrant summer day. He determines then and there to pursue his dream as a painter, never again deterred. Or this one, the MG conked out in the mountain pass, metal bits scattered beneath it, rivulets of still hot oil broken downhill. But the vista ahead, a desert in bloom. Purples and reds of mesa rock layers lightly brushed with streaks of yellow and white flowers, moving Mom to tears of rapture. She sinks to her knees, digging fingers into moist earth, never again to lose that sensation. One more for now, the cottage story, our home. I believe it was a solenoid return spring this time that breaks. Pops had to disconnect the battery to actually stop the engine. There they were, stuck yet again. And there, predictably, it was, the cottage. the pasture, the horses came with the property. The mountain view, the front yard fence line of rambling rose in bloom, the shading ash trees, the pond with the ducks, silent but for the breeze of the firs and the cedars of the surrounding forest, sighing, they swear this, my own name, me at that point, still an incubate. Pop tells each story ad nauseum to every guest and other tortured audience and laughs each time like it was the first. He watches mom as he does so, and she beams back at him, her cheeks pushed up into happy knobs, burnt red on the brown skin. Her skin's at her potter's wheel most every sunny day. You see, as much as I might roll my eyes at the story of the MG and its implied elfin bountifulness, I loved every bit of home and family in our times together. The MG I saw more as a sodded uncle, jovial, funny, and a very bad influence. Fanny and I finally did take the car out. I'll give one story, the first actually. Our signature story, we call it now. We drove to see Pops and Mom, surprised them with the big dare, all the way down from Portland. The MG was a trooper on the interstate, I'll admit. We chugged bravely in the right lane the whole way, our heads the same height as the hubs of the 18-wheelers, our fishbowl image reflected in their chrome caps, mouths agape. We breathed in exhaustively, piped into our lungs. After a time, Fanny didn't even bother to look ahead, but had her chin tucked down into her muffler. Communication was impossible anyway in the howl that enveloped us. I knew she was simply willing herself in the car to get through the experience. Off the interstate, I eased the throttle, decreasing the RPMs from an unanguished scream. Further onto windy and mercifully slow county roads, I began to relax and enjoy the drive through now familiar country. The engine coolant and oil pressure gauges had slipped a little bit. I had stuck my clammy palms from the wheel, flexed my cramped fingers. Fanny brought her chin up far enough to give me a sidelong glance and a hopeful smile. I chanced a thumbs up and thereby sealed our fate. For then, and the only predictable thing about an MG, it catastrophically failed. Suddenly it ran in fits, coughing, barking, shuddering. I didn't dare stop at first, not knowing if I could restart, but it would only run when partially choked, so we were forced to decide. Stranded less than 20 miles from Pops and Mom. However, I refused to give in and call for help. For the next 3 days, I worked with grim determination of a man who felt he must, for honor and love, prove an unpleasant point. Not to Fanny, we were of one mind about the MG, but to do that, I must overcome my own ineptness then and there. For the next 3 days, Fanny was determined to quietly stand by a man who was suddenly showing a wholly unnecessary perverse side of his nature. She found something more satisfying to do than to watch me sweat, toil, bleed, and curse over the MG. The problem for the MG turned out to be an air induction through a gap between the intake manifold and the cylinder head. It was caused by a loosening nut and warm stead threads. The MG was being kind with such a minor curveball, really. Fortunately, we had come to ground within easy walking distance of a decent garage willing to rent a lift and a little advice. What were the chances of that, you wonder? When I breathlessly explained all this to Fanny, she graced me with a forgiving smile. The solution for Fanny turned out to be 3 days left to herself. She walked the surrounding forest trails and draft out in unerring sweet verse the story of Hudson the tree squirrel and his adventures after stowing away in a picnic basket of Mr. and Mrs. Canoodle. Fanny sketched out most of the accompanying drawings there on site, including the MG in detail. In that drawing, Elvin Canoodle is prone beneath the car. Hudson's little rump and tail are all that shows he disappears in the picnic basket. That was the first book. As of this writing, there have been 20 in that series. Fanny put away her work as a website designer. I manage things, business travel, taxes, the kids. My accounting courses come in handy, and I work on the MG. Soon after the trip in question, Mom turned up in her clay pit, a quite decent-sized opal with very good color. More followed. The good fortune didn't change them much. They did take that long dreamed of trip to Cedar Grove, North Carolina, the well-known pottery center of North America. They flew. Which brings me to the present. The first kid seems squared away. He writes home frequently. His perfectly wonderful descriptions of the Hindu Kush inspired the latest Hudson adventure. Hudson at the top of the world. Impress. Hoyt and Mifflin Harcourt, children's age 5 to 8. Check it out. The daughter, however, seemed to require some grounding. Fanny and I both agreed, so to her we gave the keys. But Daddykins, she said, dismayed, and I think a little disappointed. I know nothing about it, and whispering in my ear in confidence. Derek is not mechanically inclined. Over her shoulder, I exchanged a look with the young man. He had been contemplating the MG with an open-faced horror. I smiled to her and folded her hand over the key. To myself, I thought, perfect. The end.
Thank you. That was lovely. I enjoyed that. I'm just going to pass it off to Julie Swearingen now, who is our
one of our board members, and Julie works at Roundabout Books, puts on lots and lots of events over there, helps us with ours. And Julie is also a professional editor too. So if you're interested in some editorial stuff, talk with her. She's also teaching a class starting in April, right?
Yes,
At COCC.
it's,
Four-part?
we're gonna, yeah, well, it's a 6-week course. We're gonna kind of revamp the title so it makes more sense, but basically it's how to teach yourself to self-edit. Like
Alright.
preparing it to go to an editor.
So Julie's gonna facilitate our discussion with our crime writers tonight.
Yes.
And I'm just gonna pass it right off to you.
Thank you, Mike. So as many of you saw when you came in, we have all 4 of our authors' books for sale on the back table. Most of those through Roundabout Books. Karen brought her own, which is great too. So if you want to buy books at the end of the event, I will be back there. When we planned this event, I had a copy of Karen's book, The Murder Gene, which is actually true crime, not crime fiction. So we do want to differentiate, but we're going to kind of wrap in how to write about crime in general. So I do want to start just with a little intro to each author if you're not familiar with them. So if you're not familiar with Craig Johnson, I feel like you just haven't been around for the last, I don't know how many years. So he is the well-known author of the Longmire series, which is now on Netflix and everybody loves it. Frank Zafiro is one of our local authors out of Redmond who writes several different series, and he is a retired police officer. And then Ted Haynes writes the Northwest Murder series in addition to some other titles. And then Karen is also a transplant, but is local to the Redmond area. So we're just really excited to also feature local published authors. But I do want to start with Craig. So thank you so much for joining us. He is joining us from out of the area. What I really want to start with is we'll go through everybody, but what brought you to writing crime fiction out of all of the genre fictions you could write?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say I'm sorry to the fellow authors because evidently I can't tell time. Like as far as like I thought I had my alarm set like that for the proper time like that, but then I didn't. Like, and so I'm just glad that I was able to squeak in here under the wire like that. And I do apologize for not being in early and for the technical people too like that. But it's wonderful to be here and thank you for having me. Let's see. The question is like why crime fiction? Is that what I'm getting here? Is that the proper question? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why? Right? Why? Okay. Well, I mean, there are a number of different reasons. Like, I mean, there for me, it's kind of important in the sense that you really can't. The stakes can't get any higher. That's one of the things about crime fiction is that you're basically dealing with weighty issues, those of life and death, an awful lot of the time. It's hard to write a murder mystery without an actual murder. So, the stakes are very, very high, which kind of tend to drive a plot line and a story like that. And, I think that there are a lot of different genres nowadays like that have kind of given up on the basics of storytelling. And for me, that's still, one of the absolutes, in what it is that I do. I mean, it can't just be a character development. It can't just be, a social commentary like that. There actually has to be a plot. There has to be a beginning, a middle, and an end like that. And that's where, working within crime fiction actually gives you a little bit of an advantage like that, because there are some given mechanics that you're going to have to work with. And, to me, it seems like a good fit. I know that I'm capable of writing meandering stories where, that at the end of the book, they just wander over a hill and that's the end like that. But that's not the kind of book that I want to write. I want to write books that have a really strong sense of story. I do want those same things. I do want character development. I still want social commentary. I still want humor. I still want history. I want all of those things like that. But then I also want to be able to tell a good story. I was just now, as a matter of fact, down at the barn, feeding the horses like that when it dawned on me that I needed to get my butt back up here like that and get on the computer. But I was down there feeding the horses. Like, one of the things I do every winter is like buy myself a couple of audiobooks of some classic literature like that. And I'm actually listening to Hemingway's for whom the bell tolls. And, you know, it's interesting to me like that literary fiction used to have a very strong sense of story like that. And in many ways, it seems to have kind of, given up on that to some extent, for a more experimental style and format like that. And as I'm listening to that story develop like that, it's very reassuring to me like that there were classical writers like that believed that, that you had to have something to say. And the guy that taught me that like that was a fellow by the name of Tony Hillerman. I remember I had a short story that was in Cowboys and Indians magazine like that. And it was the Tony Hillerman Cowboys and Indians magazine short story award. And I think that the title of the award was actually longer than some of the submissions. And for me like that, it was, really wonderful because I actually got to sit down and have dinner with Tony Hillerman for 4 hours. And I learned more about what it is that I do in those 4 hours than maybe I did, with a 2-year master's program like that. And one of the things he used to say was, he would always say, don't forget to tell a good story. And I think that that's one of the advantages that crime fiction has.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's go next to Ted Haynes. Ted's had several events at the bookstore, so I do know a little bit of his background. But Ted, can you tell us why you chose, you do have, these are all murder mysteries set in and around Central Oregon.
Well, first of all, let me ask you whether you can hear me,
Yes.
because I'm speaking through a phone rather than the computer. I guess not. Okay. Let me try this.
Okay, I think you can hear me now.
We can hear.
Great.
You are muted.
Right. Okay.
He's in Northern California and having internet issues.
Trying to come in on a phone as well. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to write about Central Oregon, and I want to write books that people will read, and I want to write books that I'm capable of writing. Crime fiction fits the bill very well. The most popular books out there are romance books. I don't think I can write them very well, but crime fiction I seem to be able to do, and I enjoy it very much. And very much as Craig said, the stakes are kind of built in, and the stakes are fairly high, and also there's a certain structure to it. I mean, it's constraining to try and write a sonnet, but on the other hand, you kind of know whether you did or not, and that helps. So there's a strong sense of story, and the kind of books that I like to write are not police procedurals. They're not hard-bitten. They're not people who are basically unhappy. I like to write about fairly normal people, like many of the writers in the room, who are suddenly confronted with this thing which is totally outside their experience, of a murder of somebody they know or somebody they're connected to, and they summon up skills that they didn't know they had and do things they didn't know they would dare to do. And I think that's very interesting. I like pulling that out. So that's kind of why I wrote crime fiction, for a number of reasons.
Excellent, Ted. Thank you so much. Let's turn to Karen, because as I mentioned, your book is actually true crime. But in that sense, I think maybe it's the same question. Those are really usually horrific and scary. Why would you choose to write about true crime?
So first of all, just by way of introduction, I came to the writing life very late in life. I was in grad school at Eastern Oregon University when George Benn, who was then poet laureate of Oregon, pulled me aside. I was a 40-year-old mother of 4, and he said, "You are a writer, you should be writing." And I just laughed. I mean, I said, "George, I have 4 kids, I don't have time to write." He said, "Make time." And so that's how I entered my writing career. I started my first journalism job on my 40th birthday. I know exactly who I covered and what I did. But I was a reporter with the East Oregonian and then with the Tri-City Herald in Tri-Cities, Washington, and then moved throughout the country doing reporting for different newspapers. So I came into writing through the back door, what I call boots on the ground. At my job at both the East Oregonian and at the Tri-City Herald, I was a crime beat reporter. So I was a general reporter and a columnist. So I only had the simple job of creating 3 or 4 stories a day for a deadline, oftentimes for A1. So it was a lot of boots on the ground training. I published my first book in 1997, which was memoir, and then followed that with another memoir, followed that with 2 nonfiction books about faith. And then HarperCollins published my own memoir, which was about my father's death in Vietnam. And that story, the genesis for writing that memoir, came about because of a crime I had covered as a reporter in Pendleton, where an 8-year-old boy was shot and killed by his stepfather. The family had lived here in Deschutes County before Children's Services got involved with them. And then because Children's Services was on their tail, they up and moved to Umatilla County, which was often the case if you know anything about child services. So in a roundabout way, that child's death, that autopsy on that child reminded me of something we had been told about my father's death that I then knew wasn't true, couldn't be true. If the facts about the kid were true, the facts about my father couldn't be true. So HarperCollins published that book in 2005. And so from there, I branched off into writing fiction, Appalachian fiction. My family's from Appalachia, and won several awards because the first novel I wrote was written in Appalachian language, what I call mountain language. And during all of that, a child I knew in Corvallis, Oregon was murdered. Her mother had lived with us when she was young, and I knew her. And I knew her father, who was a man from Ireland. And I didn't find out about Carly Sheehan's death until some years after it happened. But when I found out, I was actually here in Bend when I found out. When I did, I contacted the father and I wrote A Silence of Mockingbird. Through my work in the newspaper business, I come in contact with Ann Rule, and Ann Rule had encouraged me to tell Carly's story. So that's how I came to write A Silence of Mockingbird. Then I went on to write other fiction, and while I was writing other fiction, I got a call one day from one of my children telling me that another girl that I knew in Pendleton had been brutally murdered. And this was a girl who my children had babysat when they were teenagers. And so because I already had all those contacts in law enforcement, I already had respect as a crime beat reporter and as someone who had done A Silence of Mockingbird. They opened their files completely open to me. I had to FOIA them, which you don't have to do if you're doing fiction. You don't have to FOIA, but I had to FOIA, and I got access to all the records. When I was going through the records, I found out that the boy who murdered this girl I knew, that his grandfather had committed murder 40 years before in a very similar fashion. So that sent me off on a science branch of looking at the DNA connection between serial killers.
Hence why the book is called The Murder Gene. Yeah,
Exactly.
which is a very
And-
controversial topic.
And the grandfather's name was Gene.
Oh my.
Conveniently.
So that is a great segue to bring in Frank Zafiro, who is a fantastically, he writes so many books. I don't know how he does it. So Frank, I want to talk with you first, give our audience a little bit of your background and how you came to write crime fiction, but then you can maybe segue us into the research of writing crime fiction.
Certainly. Well, I was fortunate to have a career in law enforcement for 20 years. And, you know, in that profession, sometimes people are very, they go very deep in some part of it. Maybe they become a canine handler, or they become a homicide detective, or whatever position it is. And they get extremely skilled at that. That was not me. I had more of a breadth of experience. The first half of my career, I was in patrol. I was a detective for 2 years. I was a corporal. I was a training officer. I got to dip my toe in a lot of different things for, you know, 2 or 3 years at a time. And then around the 10-year mark, I stumbled backwards into the sergeant's exam and ended up getting promoted. And so the second half of my career was more of a leadership journey. And so during that portion of my career, I got to do things that I didn't get to do as a line member. I was never in good enough shape to be a SWAT member, you know, but as a lieutenant, I was assigned as the SWAT commander. So I got to see the inner workings of SWAT for a good period of time and be very involved in that unit. Same thing with the canine unit. I was not a canine handler, but I got to learn a lot by being the canine unit commander. And eventually I was promoted to captain, and in my agency, that was part of the executive staff that advised the chief and met regularly. So I got to see the upper levels of leadership and interaction with City Hall. So as you can imagine, all of this kind of helped to inform my crime fiction, at least the procedural parts of it. And so that was kind of my background career-wise. You might think that makes it obvious why I would write initially procedurals and then branch out into private investigator and more hard-boiled crime fiction. But the truth is that I've always been a writer since I was very young. And so when I really got serious about it as an adult, I was already on the job. So crime fiction was on my mind a lot, but I grew up on science fiction and fantasy. And I wanted to touch on something that both Craig and Ted said about crime fiction in particular, and how it's a little different than some other genres. I think science fiction is also this way, but it really kind of allows you to, in addition to, I agreed with everything they said about telling a good story. That's so essential. But within that story that you're telling, you can explore so many things that maybe people won't give you they wouldn't listen otherwise, but because you're telling them a great crime story, or because it's cloaked in a wonderful science fiction story, you can sometimes get past their initial defenses and get them to consider something. I'm not talking about brainwashing or changing anybody's mind even necessarily, but just getting to think about something a little bit more rather than having a knee-jerk reaction. And crime fiction certainly allows you to explore those social aspects. In addition to everything everybody else said about the genre, I wanted to add that. And then you wanted me to go into the research portion, you said? Interesting. I might be the least qualified person on the panel to do that in a way, because I haven't had, I mean, my research was my career. I haven't had to, my research tends to be like very micro, like I can't remember if it was this test or that test that told us, you know, this particular forensic answer. So I might reach out to somebody still on the job that I know to clarify that. I think most crime fiction authors are researching a layer or two higher. But I will say that if you're interested in writing crime fiction, or you do write crime fiction, certainly having a contact of someone who has been in the profession is absolutely essential, as maybe a beta reader or someone that you can bounce a quick question off of. hey, how would the cops respond to this if this happened? Something that's a little more obscure. Another great way to do some general research is that most agencies have a ride-along program and or a Citizens Academy program for the public. A ride-along is exactly what it sounds like. You get to go ride in the front, not the back, but the front of a police car for part of a shift or an entire shift, and you get to see the boots on the ground, what real police work looks like. And it's an eye-opening experience for many people. And a Citizens Academy is usually a 1 night a week thing for maybe 10, 12 weeks, where you get to learn about your police department, about procedures, about why cops do things a certain way. You get to take part in training drills that are identical to what the officers go through, conduct a traffic stop, for instance, in a training environment. And it usually culminates with a ride along in most agencies. So those are 2 real quick ways to get a lot of general knowledge relatively quickly that is firsthand knowledge. And I feel like that resonates more with an author if they experienced it firsthand, and that translates onto the page. But I'd be curious to hear what some of the other authors have done in their research.
Yeah, I would too. So I want to turn it over to Craig Johnson with kind of that same question. And maybe it's, towards the very beginning of your Longmire series, but how did you start kind of researching the police side of the stories and the character?
Well, when I first started out, it was like it keeps getting longer and longer. And but when I first started out, the first novel, the Cold Dish, at that point in time, everything in crime fiction seemed to be very noir oriented. Everything was like, alcoholic detectives in big cities burying bodies, in their backyards and everything. And that just really wasn't the people that I knew in law enforcement. The people I knew in law enforcement, made incredible sacrifices, and really cared, about the people. I mean, I did a lot of ride-alongs and spent a lot of time with a lot of sheriffs, still do, like here in Wyoming and Montana, like that. And, the phrase that you hear from them over and over again is my people, and that's kind of where, sheriffing is a little bit different from other forms of law enforcement in the sense that you have to get elected. Not only are you a police officer, but you're also a politician. Whenever the book's been translated in a number of languages, and whenever I'm overseas, at trying to explain how sheriffing works, they're appalled. They're like, you elect a police officer? Like that doesn't seem right. And so, but the thing it gave me it gave me an access point as far as the character was concerned with the community. I mean, I really didn't want, a guy in chrome sunglasses, driving around, glaring at people. I wanted somebody that people were not going to be afraid of, the people that could go and knock on a door. And that I've noticed that that's particularly the case, with sheriffing like that. People that would never walk into a police office in their entire lives, they'll walk right into a sheriff's office, and come in there and say, hey, my neighbor's putting a fence up and I think he's over on my property putting this fence in like that. You're going to have to come down there and take a look at this like that. And the thing is that they're giving, somebody their most treasured item in a democracy, which is their vote. And so they feel as though they have a connection, with that individual like that. And that's kind of the way I saw Walt. I wanted to go against that grain of noirism that was going on here about 20 years ago. And there's still a very strong rather strong suit of it in crime fiction. But I thought, what if you did the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state? It would kind of rely on a lot of the strengths, not only of, paring down some of the business and crime fiction, but also some of the aspects of a good Western, where, you do have that morality play, and you have a very clear and defined world, for which those characters, move in. And I thought it might be interesting to do that like that. And it came with some good points. It came with some bad points. One of the first ones being that, Warner Brothers came knocking and said that they wanted to make a TV show out of the books. And I remember looking at them and going, why? Why in the world would you want to make a TV show out of the sheriff, the least populated county, the least populated state? And they felt as though it was something different, enough so that it would be interesting, and that Walt was, different enough like that it would be interesting. And And then the other problem that I ran into very quickly, of course, is how many people can you kill in the least populated county, in the least populated state, before things start getting stupid after a while. And so to combat that, what I did was I started doing Walt almost like a ball team. I'm happy to see baseball is starting back up with spring training. And but I would do Walt home and away. And I'm sure the panel is going to answer this better than I can like that. But generally in law enforcement, it's not that what you see in Hollywood an awful lot of the time, which is, hey, this is our turf, this is our jurisdiction, all those type of things. Generally, it's more of a foxhole kind of mentality that you see in the military, which is like, we've got a tough situation here and we need all hands on deck. As more people want to jump in this foxhole and try and help us out with this, like that, the happier we're going to be. And so, what I started doing was Walt would have like a home crime fiction piece, one of the novels, where something would happen in Absaroka County. And then as his reputation started to grow like that, and his ability in dealing with cold cases and violent cases like that, came more to the fore like that, then he would be asked to, by these other sheriffs, in Wyoming and Montana and South Dakota and other places like that, to kind of join in, maybe take a look at these cases and see what it was that he could do about them like that. And then the other, fun thing that's fun for me like that is that, you're not trapped, with where these characters are now. I mean, you can, go back in those characters in their past, and find other points, in their histories like that, or maybe developed into, making them who it is that they are. And that for me, is always a great joy as far as that's concerned too, like that. And as far as the research is concerned, my gosh, I hate to be, so stereotypical, but we're getting away with murder here. It's wonderful what we do, because we can go, find something that we think is interesting and something we think we want to put in our book, and you get to go out and read about it and call it work. My gosh, like that. You get to sit there on the sofa next to the wood burning stove, and read about Japanese internment camps, during World War II, which is what I'm, doing right now. And it's such a joy like that to be able to do that, and take that that ability as a reader like that and turn it into a functional part of what you do as a writer. It's a joy, to have that in your life like that. And it's a great excuse to sit around and read too, like that. And you can't be a writer without being a reader.
That is true. I want to bring Ted Haynes back into this, because I think he, with his book, Mirror Pond Murder, I don't know if you guys know this, there actually is a historical aspect of what that book includes, was that there was Ted, correct me if I'm wrong, I remember from your event, there was a skull found in Mirror Pond in the 50s or 60s.
Well, there was a body found near it in the early 60s. That really happened.
Right.
And I put a fictional body in the Mirror Pond in the 2000s that had been there since about 1985. But I had to research how long at least a skeleton would last. And it turns out not very long unless it's deeply buried in the mud. So I had to make sure that it was buried where the air couldn't get to it, where oxygen couldn't get to it. But research, one of the joys of, I enjoy research, as Craig alluded to. And one of the great things is writing about Central Oregon, I get to drive around and look at things and participate in things and write about them. And my latest book, Pole Pedal Murder, is centered around the big pole pedal paddle race in Bend. And it was fun because there's a lot in there that isn't really about the murder. It's about people being in the race, but it's tied in. One of the proposed contestants gets murdered, and somebody gets murdered during the race. And it's fun to get the details right. And in that race, they have to wear a little transistor so that they know when they pass a certain point. There are no pictures of what it looks like. You have to go look at the race to figure out what it looks like. And plus you get a lot more atmosphere out of it doing that too. But as I said, I get a lot of research. You mentioned the Mirror Pond murders. A lot of that takes place at the Rajneeshpuram, which many of the people on this call know was in the 1980s north of Central Oregon, near Antelope. But it was founded by an Indian guru who had so many followers. He was very rich. This is the guy with like 77 Rolls Royces. and he drove them past his followers every day. Well, part of the story is set there. Well, I had to read an awful lot about that, about people who all over there. And for the not Bachelor murders, I had to read the German occupation of Norway and what that was like. And also had to go back and find out what Mount Bachelor was like in the late 1960s. And it was a lot smaller than it was now. And so reading is one of the joys. But also I get to ask a lot of my friends, I don't know much about guns or airplanes or snowmobiling, and but my friends do, and I get to talk to them about it, and they get excited about it. And I have one friend who seems to know an awful lot about drug smuggling, and I don't know how he knows that, but it's very useful. So I take advantage of that. So research is fun.
Yeah, it's good to have a network. So Craig kind of alluded to something that I think we can talk about with your true crime, especially with the murder gene, but things that are set locally. He mentions how are you killing off these people, but how are you also treating something that really happened with like the delicacy and respect that it deserves when these are real things that people recognize the area or they recognize the names and that kind of thing.
So there is a tension there when you're covering true crime, because there are victims and there are victims' families. And in both cases with me, I knew those families. And so when approaching Carly's story, I knew right off that if I didn't have Dad's permission, I wasn't going to move forward. So he's the first person I went to. He was all on board with it. Had he not been, I don't think I would have pursued the story. But as a writer, I felt an obligation because I had inside information about the character of Carly's mom, who had lived with us for a year. I felt that there were things that need to be addressed, social commentary, as it were, to a point, on how courts treat moms differently than they do dads, not based upon the actions of the moms versus the actions of the dads. In Carly's case, she had a very devoted father, but because he was an immigrant, he was treated differently by the courts than Mom, who, by the way, looked a lot like Halle Berry. She had that exterior that we rely so much on in this culture. And so it was a difficult thing to, the other thing is that I loved her mom, and I had loved Carly, and I loved David. So I had that personal connection. In Amy Jane Brandhagen's death, it was different. I did not have the cooperation of the parents. In fact, before I ever began researching the story, I got word through a family friend that came to me and said, came to my child actually, who then came to me and said, the Brandhagens don't want you to write this story. And so I had to weigh as a writer, do I press on with the story? Because there is a bigger story here than just the murder of Amy Jane, and risk that alienation that I knew would come and did come. And so those are all things, I mean, as a journalist, it was not new to me. I should say that, right? As a journalist, I often had to write stories that piss people off. So it was just part of my job as what I see as being a truth teller. And I want to make a statement here about fiction versus nonfiction. You can tell as much truth in fiction as you can in nonfiction. I've done it both ways. There are benefits to doing it both ways. So, for me, the overriding truth of who Amy Jane's murder was bigger than what had been told. And I felt like the public only had a small portion. I mean, we do this all the time in every crime story, true crime or otherwise. It's good guys versus bad guys, right? If you're a murderer, you have to be a horrible human being. And if you're the victim, you had to be angelic. And those are never true, right? We know this from writing fiction. If you write a fiction character that has no redeeming quality, nobody wants to read that person, right? Although there are people in life who seem to have no redeeming qualities. Let me put my social political commentary in there. There are a few that have no redeeming qualities. But when in pursuing the Amy Jane Grandhagen story, Amy Jane was not the angelic person her parents wanted the community to believe that she was. She was wonderful and she did not deserve to be murdered. But Luke Chang, who murdered her, had been a perfect person up until he committed that murder. And so my research took me to North Carolina, Alabama, and throughout Oregon. And in addition to FOIA here, I did that in all the counties, Michigan and Wisconsin, where the other murders had happened 40 years prior. I have 6 notebooks full of documentation. So when I'm doing true crime versus historical fiction, which I've also written, it's always looking at newspapers, academic journals. For the DNA research, I was talking to people in London and Amsterdam and throughout Europe who had studied this issue of DNA and how it carries on. So it's complicated.
So that leads me to something that I hate to say I didn't actually prep any of the authors to answer about, but I think it's come up organically, and I want to switch it to Frank for a second. In our last event, Frank, if I am not mistaken, your most recent book, there is a character who is sexually assaulted. How do you treat these things when you're talking about a victim, whether the victim is still alive or is now deceased, within your, true crime or crime fiction? How are you thinking about your victim as a character too?
Well, I think if you treat all of your characters like they're real people, you're off to a good start, because regardless of whether they're angelic or not, victims deserve our sympathy and our respect, right? And I think that's what I'm hearing from the true crime author. I think it's true with fiction as well. And some crimes are a little more socially touchy than other crimes. I mean, somebody beating somebody up is a bad crime, especially if they're badly beaten, if it's a felonious assault. But I think everybody would agree that a sexual assault is probably more impactful and certainly has a lot of social issues surrounding it. And so I think earlier in my career, I looked at it almost from a police officer or detective standpoint. And so there was sympathy and empathy for the victim, but it was also very much tied up in the professional part of it. Yes, I feel sympathy or empathy for you, but also I need to establish rapport with you so I can interview you, so I can go find the person that did this to you. And some of my earlier work, I think a little more of that leaks through. In the last decade or so, I've tried to soften that a bit and really show that, each of these victims have a story, and it's an important one. Even if you don't share a lot of it, it's important that you know what it is and that you treat it with some respect, or actually the utmost respect. Being a victim doesn't, turn you into a saint, but you certainly were victimized, and you deserve to be treated with respect. And particularly, like I said, with a sexual assault, there's other stuff that comes into play there. Whether you want to call it social or political or whatever, or just the delicacy, because it involves sex. And let's face it, here in the US, we're weird about sex compared to a lot of our European cousins. And so any crime that involves that has this extra bit of stigma attached to it, an extra bit of sensitivity. And so I think when you're writing these, you really have to be cognizant of that and proceed carefully. If you don't get it right in the first draft, you better be looking at it pretty hard in the revision process.
Craig, I kind of want to ask you the same question, and I will admit that I know Longmire more from Netflix than from the books, sorry. But from what I remember of the show, and I loved it, he's investigating a lot of times people who are murdered they are bad people, right? Like they're drug dealers, they've murdered somebody else and somebody else has killed them. So how do you you're still humanizing that victim because your main character still cares enough to solve it?
Well, it's difficult for me to approach it from the perspective of the television show. Like I'd much prefer like that to refer to it, from the development of my own work, like that, which would be the books like that. And for me, like that, I mean, there's a really great quote from T.S. Eliot: "All cats is gray in the dark." And I think that, my fellow panelists have been wonderful in essaying that particular aspect. Like that, I mean, there are good and bad aspects to just about every single character like that. And that's your job. Like that's your job to show, those different facets of the human character like that. And I have to admit that like an awful lot of the time like that, I really enjoy the fact, that that some of my good characters have some bad aspects to their character, like, and some of the bad characters, the antagonists in the books, you have to, make them fully dimensionalized characters like that. And I actually love it whenever someone will read one of my books and then they'll come to me and they'll say, well, okay, I didn't approve of what it was that character did, but I understand why it is that they did what it is that they did like that. And I think that that's when you're on the ground of good literature like that, where you're on the ground of good character development like that. And those complexities are what it is that's going to make all of those things like that really readable in my mind like that. And that's just a given like that, as far as like good writing is concerned, it seems to me.
Excellent, thank you so much for that. Mike, it's about 6:30. Should we open for Q&A?
Sure.
Okay.
I don't know if we lost Ted. Did we lose him?
We might have. He might call back in. Yeah, he's dealing with a lot of high winds and bad weather down there.
Yeah.
So we can take questions from both our in-person and our Zoom audience. I can see the questions in the chat. So does anybody here right in front of me have a question right now? You all look like I'm the teacher in a class and I just told you there's a pop quiz. Did they answer the question so well that you don't have any for them? That would mean I did a very good job, Mike. Okay. So the other thing we can do as we're waiting to see if maybe some questions come in, this is something I do to my authors at the bookstore, both in person and virtually. And we had kind of a mention of it, but I would love them to recommend 1 to 2 books in kind of maybe your genre to have somebody read that's going to, help them both as a reader and a writer. So let's start with Frank. Frank, who is another author that you think people should be reading?
Well, my good friend Colin Conway is a hell of a writer and not getting nearly enough notice for that. He writes among other series, a procedural series called the 509 Crime Stories. 509, for those of you who in the know, is the area code for Eastern Washington, everything to the east of the Cascades. And it's kind of cool because this procedural series rotates through about a half a dozen, maybe 8 different characters in the lead role. And so not only do you get to see things from a different point of view, but you get to see the different characters through the eyes of other characters. So you may like a particular character and then find out a narrator 2 books later thinks they're a golden child or some other negative thing. And so it's kind of an interesting way to get a little bit of a 360 degree of that department. Now, full disclosure, I co-author a series with Colin, so we're pretty close. So I'm very biased in making this recommendation, but I guarantee you won't be disappointed. He even writes cozies for men, so give him a look there. And then I'm going to go on the real safe route, and I'll tell you, I think I really admire Dennis Lehane's work. Now it's not procedural usually, but in particular his Kenzie and Gennaro Private Investigator series. It's about 6 books, one of which is kind of 10 years after the bulk of the 5 that called The Moonlight Mile. That was really good. The thing I like about Lehane's work, and Craig, I think you're on a panel with him at last BoucherCon or Left Coast Crime or something, if I remember right. But he does such a good job of writing beautiful prose that's literary without a doubt, but at the same time writing gritty crime fiction that isn't so above your head that you feel like you need an MFA just to read it. He really melds the two incredibly well, and then brings home all the emotion that comes with the story that he's telling. I mean, just it's fantastic. And that's not even talking about Shutter Island or some of his other work. So you might call it a cop-out picking Dennis Lehane, but I'll tell you, I think he's one of the masters in crime fiction.
Craig, we'll switch to you. Well, who are some of your recommendations?
Oh my goodness. Like, well, I mean, I can, it's kind of nice to be like speaking to like, a Northwestern audience like that, because one of the names that immediately comes to mind is a fellow by the name of Willie Vlautin, who's an author out of, just outside of Portland, I believe. Like, and Willie's just an absolutely magnificent writer. Like, and he's not particularly what I would call, once again, a crime fiction writer like that, but an awful lot of, what his plots and what his characters kind of contend with, tends to have a little bit of an edge to it like that, and deal with that substratum like that of society like that, where, that sometimes the law kind of has to come in and make a play. I just Don't Skip Out on Me, Lean on Pete, look at their Motel Chronicles. I mean, he does have the advantage of also being an amazing, excuse me, like an amazing musician. He's also like one of the lead singers, like a lead guitarist for a group called Richmond Fontaine. And he actually can do soundtracks, for his books, which is really not fair. That's not fair, right? Because not all of us have that opportunity like that, but I think he's just a magnificent writer. And if you haven't read Willie Vlautin, you definitely need to get out there and grab a couple of Willie's books and read them. My gosh, I mean, I can go on and on like that. I mean, there's another by the name of Brady Udall who wrote a magnificent book called The Miracle Life of Edgar Mint, which I think is absolutely magnificent like that. And and then there's these new group of mystery writers that are coming up, like S.A. Cosby and David Wantably Weeben. He does an amazing book with Winter Counts like that. It's just it's a wonderful time like to be working in crime fiction like that, because there are a lot of new voices that are coming up, and you're not like basically reading somebody who's written 37 books at this point in time like that. They're new and exciting voices like that. And then of course there are always the ones that you look at. I just got finished doing a wonderful panel with Robert Crace down at the Tucson Book Festival like that. And I mean, he was so gracious like that. And, whenever you meet someone who has that, that type of success, and yet they're still approachable and they're still, reasonable and want to talk to you about, the craft, about what it is that they do and how they do it like that. And, I've read all of his books like that, and it was just a joy to be there on that panel with him like that. But, the list goes on forever like that. And I won't be able to come up with all of the names of all of the people like that I'd like to mention here in this brief amount of time, but at least I came up with a few.
Excellent. Thank you so much. If you guys don't know, Willie Vlautin has been to the area several times. He's been with both the library and our bookstore, so we'll definitely have him back. He's a nice guy. Karen, give us a couple of true crime books that you think were done, very well, or people doing true crime that you like.
Yeah, so those would be interesting because I'm not particularly a true crime reader.
Okay.
I did read, I went through my Ann Rule spell back decades ago. I have some crime fiction or mystery fiction that I really love. One is a writer out of North Carolina named Wiley Cash, and his Dark Road to Mercy is one of my favorite books. It's just so well done. Wiley teaches at UNC and is just a terrific writer. He has several books out, but Dark Road to Mercy was one of my favorite. Everybody knows Jamie Lee Burke, who is excellent at this. There is an up and coming writer out of Ashland, Oregon, named LJ Breedlove, and she's got a mystery series with a great character named Matt Davis. They're set in Alaska where she used to be a reporter. So those are cute.
Yeah, so Ted is back. Yay, Ted. So we were just hoping you could give us a couple of authors or titles in kind of the crime fiction genre that you would recommend. Is he, hold on, you're muted still, 1 sec.
He has to unmute.
Yeah, are you able to do that for him? Okay,
He's on a different device.
okay.
And I don't quite know which one it is.
All right, hold on, Ted. We're gonna come back to you in a second. There's a question in the chat that I do want to talk about because especially with our 3 offsite panelists, it's really big. And I'm guessing this is Irene asking this question. Why do you think it is that genre writers write so well and quickly, and how do you know you've got a series? So I want to go to Craig first. When you wrote the first Longmire book, did you know it was a series? Was that your plan?
No, not at all. It was a standalone book was what it was. I mean, you know, I've told the story numerous times before like that, but it took me like the better part of 10 years, you know, to actually write the first draft of The Cold Dish. And, you know, I didn't even consider the fact that I might have like, you know, the ability to write a second book. So it was all about, you know, just being a singular book. Okay. And I don't think this is a unique situation like that. Whenever Viking Penguin picked it up like that, they said, you know, we want to publish the book, but we also think that this is a series. We think with these characters in this place that they're going to be people are going to want more of these like that. And that's when I, with the knowledge of not even having had one book published, looked at the president of Penguin USA, Catherine Court, and said, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we should do that like that. I had some other ideas I want to bounce off you like that. And her response to me was, why don't you go back to your ranch in Wyoming and sit down and think about this like that? And so I did like that. And one of the dirty little secrets about The Cold Dish, the first book that I wrote is that it was actually 650 pages long. It was kind of like War and Peace in Absaroka County was what it was like. And one of the first things I had to do was I had to cut like about 250 pages out of it before it was even going to be publishable. And so a lot of the backstories, you know, and a lot of the relationships and a lot of things, you know, got lost, you know, in that first book. And I thought, well, if I'm going to have those stories come out, you know, I'm going to have to be the guy that's going to be writing those stories. And so that kind of like, you know, set me on the track, you know, to a series like it. And of course, the difficulty with that is, of course, yeah, you can take 10 years for your first book, but then the next book they want in 6 months. And so, you know, you better jump in and be able to ride like that right off the bat like that. And, you know, fortunately like that, you'll have enough like that to work with after those 10 years of trying to write that first book that you can actually sit down and, you know, really, you know, get into what it is that you're doing like it and learn the discipline that you need to have like that. The other thing is, it's an amazing thing that happens to you, you know, as a human being when you all of a sudden have success, when somebody actually, you know, I mean, otherwise, you know, so much of the time you're out there swimming in the ocean without a life preserver like that. And, you know, suddenly you've got a book contract. Suddenly you've got like a publisher that wants you, you know, to be doing a book a year. You know, suddenly you've got an absolute career in something that maybe you never thought would ever possibly happen. And so when that happens, it provides a pretty wonderful impetus, you know, to getting you involved in what it is that you're doing and maybe becoming a success and being a writer.
Excellent, thank you. Frank, there's another question in the chat that I want to pose to you. Amanda asked, what is your process to how you structure your stories?
That's a big question. You know, Well, first off, I feel like every story has its own natural best length. So, don't try to turn a short story into a novel or shrink a novel down to a short story. But Craig mentioned there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. The standard setup, the middle portion, and then you get to the end of the book where things are resolved. But if I'm being honest, a lot of that structure doesn't necessarily come to mind initially. Usually what happens with me is I will have a question. What would happen if, and it's usually along the lines of what would happen if these characters had to deal with this situation. And I think that through, and I think about how that proceeds logically and what the end result might be. And it's only then that raw material kind of gets shaped into something approaching structure. And I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but I mean, everybody's process is different. And so that's usually how it works for me. I think you follow the logic of the story and worry a little bit more about the external, applying structure externally, once you've got that raw material figured out.
Excellent, thank you. So Ted is back, and Ted, I want to go back to a question that Craig answered, but I want your take on it. Did you know the Northwest Mystery Series was a series when you first started?
Yes and no. I knew I wanted it to be a series, but I had no idea what the subsequent books would be. So I set up the characters, I set up the setting, and I figured the characters would evolve, and they have. But I certainly didn't plan the whole series out. And to build on what Frank said, which I think exactly the same way about plotting out a book or plan a book, is I have a few essential ideas. I try to outline them, but I can't outline the whole thing because the ideas come when you're writing. And what would happen if, and wouldn't this be interesting? And this character wouldn't do that, it'd do something else. So a lot of that comes while writing. I don't think you can, well, at least I can't plan the whole thing out in advance.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have anything in the room? Yes.
Yes.
What's your question?
Yes, for Craig. Craig, what is your relationship with Netflix like? In particular, are they taking what you've written and using it as a jumping off point and writing episodes or something? And if so, what is that like to have people doing that?
The very first meeting that I had with the producers, because the show itself is actually produced by Warner Brothers. And then what happens is if you're lucky enough, like with your pilot, it gets picked up by a network. And our first network was A&E, which we did 3 years with them. We were the highest rated scripted drama that they ever had, and they rewarded us by canceling us. And fortunately, there was this thing called Netflix that picked us up and grabbed us and ran with us, and we did another 3 seasons with them. And here we are 7 years later, and it's still one of the top 20 shows on Netflix, which is, I think, a little bit of a surprise to everybody. I think basically what Netflix and Warner Brothers thought was, we've got this little cowboy Indian show, and after a year or two, it'll go away, and that'll be the end of it. And so far, that's not been the case, because there's nothing that networks or corporations love better than doing nothing and making money. And pretty much that's where we are with Longmire right now. But the first meeting that I had with the producers, they said, your books don't break down to a 42-minute teleplay. And my response to that was, thank God. If they did, you shouldn't be reading them. And so what they had to do was take bits and pieces from the different novels and use them as jumping off points, for 42-minute teleplays. And I think they did a really magnificent job because they've done a wonderful job of capturing the feel and the tone and the texture of the books, of capturing the essence of the characters and all of that. And my relationship with them has been actually pretty fantastic. My relationship with the producers, the directors, and the actors. We actually have this thing called Longmire Days. I don't know if you've heard about it, but we have this thing called Longmire Days here in Buffalo, Wyoming, which is a little town of 4,000 people. And the actors show up every summer with about 20,000 of their closest friends. And it's the closest thing that Wyoming has to a FEMA disaster is what it's like that, because the banks and the ATM machines run out of money, the grocery stores and restaurants run out of food, and everybody wanders around with their cell phone trying to get them to work, where it's blown up, the one little tower that we have here in north central Wyoming at the base of the Bighorn Mountains. But it's really kind of great like that, because it raises an awful lot of money. I think it was just last year we gave $30,000 to the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Resource Center up in Montana. We give away a lot of charity money like that, which makes it really kind of worthwhile. To kind of turn the circle around like that, and come back in and again try and solve some of those problems that that we hopefully deal with in the novels and in the television show. But yeah, I that one of the panels that I did with Robert Grace and Thomas Perry like that while I was in Tucson here just a couple of weeks ago, like that was actually about what happens when your work gets translated to the screen. And an awful lot of authors have really horrible stories like that, where they've been abused, or they were not included in the decision-making process or anything like that. But I don't know, I had really good people to work with like that, and so it was and has been a continual joy in my life, I have to admit.
Excellent, thank you for that question. Do we have any others? Yes.
Yeah, so you guys have all brought up, you had different resources that you drew upon in your past, and I was curious, any pointers and advice for making new connections when you're doing your research? How do you go about making those connections?
So let's have Karen answer this one. Yeah, so Karen,
So you have to get over your fear of being afraid to reach out. Like, it's nothing to cold call somebody, and which I did when I was on all of my books. I cold called somebody, and you just have to say, I'm an author, I'm working on this. So you have to own that authorship, which, like, if you watch the Oscars this week, they talk about imposter syndrome. They're out there getting Oscars and they still feel like imposters. And I can remember when I first started out, I would think, if I got published in this particular magazine, then I would be a real writer. Or if I got into the New York Times, I would be a real writer. Or if I got to NPR, I would be. So it's always like that carrot held out in front of you. The thing is, I've done all of that, and yet I still have to deal with that imposter syndrome. So you have to own it, and you just have to be willing to go to that law enforcement officer and say, I'm an author, I'm working on a story about this particular, and what they said about having beta readers who are in law enforcement or in the field that you're writing in is so critical. Before I send any manuscript off to my editor, it's already been through my beta readers. And I learned early on, got great advice from my writing coach, who said, if a reader comes back with a question, don't get defensive, realize that you failed to do something, right? You have not communicated accurately. So that was early on advice for me that I took and I owned, and it's helped me tremendously. And I take readers from, when I did the Murder Gene, there is a former retired lieutenant of Oregon State Police who lived in Pendleton, knew the girl who was murdered, but he was one of my beta readers. So you can't be you can be afraid, but you just have to overcome being afraid. That's all it is. It's what they say about courage. It's not the lack of fear, it's the willingness to do it in spite of the fear.
So as a follow-up to that, what was your experience when you did cold calls? Were they
They're
open to
always,
you, or
they're
they say, no, I
always,
don't want to talk to you, or go
I've
away?
had people turn me down, but very few. They almost always, particularly if you're asking about their profession, people love to talk about themselves and their work And if they're passionate about their work, they're willing to, I've done things like had forestry people take me out in the woods and show me different kinds of trees and stuff so that I have some idea of what I'm writing about. Just simple things like that, that you think you would know, but you don't necessarily know. I always rely on the expert. It saves my butt.
So how do you know who to ask?
So give me an example. What would you be looking for?
Amanda, what would you be looking for?
You know what, actually, I want to loop Frank into this
Yeah.
one just because he has the law enforcement background. So Frank, maybe somebody who doesn't have the connections. So like for me personally, my dad was a sheriff's deputy for 35 years. So like I still have some of those, but I don't know a lot of them personally. So Frank, if some brand new, author wants to research the timetable of what a DNA test really takes in a lab, can they call like an information officer and just say, I have this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're better off. The short answer is yes, you can, but I think that you're probably better off if you reach out to the public information officer, just more generally to kind of ask if they have a ride-along program, if they have a Citizens Academy, and to kind of create a baseline of knowledge for yourself, because in that process, you're going to make connections. I mean, when you go to a Citizens Academy, the officers from the agency come out to there and teach their specialty. And so you're going to meet them and you're going to have an opportunity to ask them specialty questions, and they'll give you their card almost certainly. And you could probably call them back and you could ask them when they hand you the card, if I have a question, can I shoot you a message? And I would hazard a guess that at least 9 times out of 10, the answer is going to be yes. In a time period where I think a lot of police officers feel very misunderstood and very misrepresented at times, there's that desire to be understood. So if somebody comes to you and is asking to understand, I think that you're going to see a lot of positive reactions to that. One other resource not to overlook is that a lot of communities have some sort of an historical society. We're fortunate in Spokane, they actually have a Spokane Police Historical Society. So it's, drilled down to that specificity. I'm going to be making use of it with the next book that I'm writing with Colin, because it takes place in the 1950s and the 1970s. And I don't have enough expertise to write about policing in those eras without doing some significant research. But even if they don't have a specific police department or law enforcement museum or whatever, just your I don't want to say run of the mill, but for lack of a better term, your basic historical society for the region that you're in is going to have as a subset, law enforcement history, or it's going to be sprinkled throughout one way or another. And so you can get a lot of information that way as well. But it's all about building relationships. And I think if you called the PIO and said, can I get this information on a DNA test? I think that PIO would be tempted to say, here, let me Google that for you. But if you've talked to that PIO in the past and you've had a relationship with people, I think that the reaction would be, yeah, sure, shoot me those details and I'll get you an email with the best answer I can. And that PIO would go to a homicide detective and say, realistically, what's the answer to this? People want to be helpful, but they want to be even more helpful for people that they know. So create those relationships.
Sounds like maybe we should do another panel with the police officers about questions you should ask them if you're writing true crime fiction. Do we have another question?
No, I agree with that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, I think we're gonna, oh, sorry.
I was gonna say, and don't overlook your local library.
Yeah.
They are
Absolutely.
a great resource.
Well, I want to thank sorry.
I do want to ask one more question. You said you became a reporter at Florida, I think you said? All right. Well, I was in the newspaper business and I do know that not every writer is a reporter, but every reporter has to be a writer. It had to be very tough. No. Was it tough for you to come in and know how to ask tough questions? You're not born with that, So you started at 40. And from day one, your job demanded you ask tough questions.
Yeah, Tim.
How'd you do that?
So my first assignment that they gave me, I never even held a reporter's notebook. The editor handed me a reporter's notebook and said, there's a county commissioner meeting at the courthouse. Go over there and write down anything they say that's important. Have you ever been to a county commissioner meeting? Any of you? Raise your hand. Our county at the time, Umatilla, was dealing with the Army depot. Now, I grew up an Army brat, so I know a little bit of Army lingo. But the Army depot, you're dealing with FEMA, back to FEMA in Wyoming, which is hilarious because my son lived in Wyoming, so I know what he said is true. But you're dealing with acronyms. So I went in and the county commissioners are talking Latin for all I know. And I went back to the newsroom and they said, did anything important come out of the meeting? And I said, no. No idea what they said. But as far as asking questions, I think it's just a matter of having a curious mind. Because I was a mother and had 4 kids and had lived in the area, I knew the area, I knew people, and was involved in issues related to what we're all involved in, you know, as family members and as parents raising kids. So whatever question I had, I just was not afraid to ask. Like, I saw that as my job to ask it.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here, for being on Zoom, and please give a round of applause to all of our authors. Thank you so much, Craig, for joining us from obviously outside the area. Ted down in California. Frank is out in Redmond with me, and as is Karen, and we made that trek in on some weather that always looks a little iffy. I just really appreciate everybody being here to talk about, you know, all things crime. Yeah, all right. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.